Somewhere above Earth's atmosphere, a fleet of alien warships was about to make the biggest mistake in the history of interstellar diplomacy, and not one of them knew it yet. For 300 years, the Galactic Conclave had never lost a negotiation. Not once. Every stubborn species, every defiant colony, every government that dared to resist conclave trade terms had eventually folded under the weight of a single, simple strategy: fear. And nothing inspired fear quite like the Vorkai. The Vorkai was not just a monster. It was a monster, a 12-meter-tall apex predator from Dreth Prime, a planet so hostile that even the Conclave's own terraforming engineers refused to set foot on its surface without armed escort. Its hide was thick enough to deflect small arms fire. Its jaws could shear through reinforced durasteel as easily as a human bites into bread. Entire Dreth Prime ecosystems have been shaped around avoiding it, fleeing it, or dying to it. Ambassador Kale Vorant had personally witnessed the creature break free of its restraints during a demonstration on the Offran homeworld. He'd watched seasoned Offran diplomats, beings who survived 3 civil wars and a planetary siege, collapse into whimpering surrender within minutes. The Conclave hadn't even needed to negotiate. The Offran signed everything put in front of them, just to make the creature go away. That was the plan for Earth. Humanity had been, by Conclave standards, insufferably difficult. They asked too many questions. They demanded fair trade terms. They had the audacity to counterpropose instead of simply accepting whatever resource extraction agreement the Conclave offered. 3 previous negotiation attempts had ended in stalemate, and Kale was tired of stalemates. So today, he would do what the Conclave always did when words failed. He would bring the monster. The transport ship carrying the Vorkai's containment pod descended through Earth's stratosphere, escorted by 4 Conclave cruisers designed less for combat and more for spectacle. Gleaming hulls meant to remind the locals exactly how far behind they were technologically. Kale stood at the viewport, watching the blue-green planet grow larger, and allowed himself a small, confident smile. Today, Earth would learn what every other species in the galaxy already knew. You do not say no to the Conclave. The negotiation chamber inside the Conclave's diplomatic vessel was sterile and imposing, all sharp angles and cold light, designed specifically to make visitors feel small. Human negotiators sat on one side of a long obsidian table. 7 of them, led by a woman named Serafina Voss, who Kale had been briefed on extensively. Voss was, according to Conclave intelligence reports, dangerously competent. A former agricultural economist turned diplomat, she had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions and refusing to be rushed. The reports also noted, almost as an afterthought, that she had an unusual fondness for field research, whatever that meant. Kale didn't care about her resume. No amount of competence mattered against raw, visceral terror. Ambassador Voss, Kale said, settling into a seat across from her, his translator Crystal humming softly at his throat. We've reached an impasse in our previous discussions. I believe a change in atmosphere might help clarify the stakes. Serafina looked up from a small tablet, unbothered. She had short dark hair pulled back, sharp eyes, and the kind of calm Kale associated with species who simply hadn't yet learned what was coming. Clarify away, Ambassador. Kale gestured to the chamber's rear doors. 2 Conclave handlers in heavy environmental suits stepped forward, gripping a thick containment harness. Behind them, the doors hissed open. The Vorkai entered. It had to duck its massive horned head just to fit through the doorway. 12 meters of corded muscle and obsidian-black armor plating rippling beneath the harness restraints. Its eyes, 6 of them, arranged in 2 vertical rows, swept the room with predatory intelligence. A low rumble rolled out of its chest, vibrating the table, the floor, the air itself. Its jaws parted slightly, revealing rows of serrated teeth the length of human forearms. Every human in the room went rigid. Finally, Kale thought, watching their faces drain of color, finally they understand. He folded his hands and addressed the table with practiced gravity. This is a Vorkai Ambassador Voss, an apex predator from Dreth Prime. I trust it communicates our position more clearly than words ever could. The room held its breath. Kale waited for the screaming, the bargaining, the desperate scramble toward the door that had worked on 17 previous species. Instead, Serafina Voss set down her tablet, picked up a small ceramic mug of coffee from the table in front of her, and took a slow, unhurried sip. She studied the Vorkai for a long moment, not with fear, but with the focused, narrow-eyed curiosity of someone examining a particularly interesting specimen at a zoo. The creature's nostrils flared. It tilted its massive head, 6 eyes fixing on her in return, clearly puzzled by a target that wasn't running. Then Serafina asked a question that would end Ambassador Kale's career, rewrite 3 centuries of conclave diplomatic doctrine, and forever change how the galaxy understood humanity. What does it eat? Kale blinked. I what? Its diet, Serafina clarified, setting down her mug. What's the primary food source on Dreth Prime? Large grazing fauna? Smaller predators? I'm curious about its position in the food chain. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Kale's translator crystal hummed uselessly at his throat, as if even the device sensed it had no precedent for processing this response. Around the table, his fellow conclave delegates exchanged glances of pure bewilderment. The Vorkai itself seemed almost offended, letting out a low growl that no one in the room, for the first time in its operational history, found remotely threatening. Ambassador, Serafina pressed, not unkindly. Is that classified information, or do you simply not know? And that was only the beginning. 3 light years away, an entire species was about to discover that the most dangerous thing about humanity wasn't their weapons. It was their appetite. Ambassador Kale stared at Serafina Voss, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. In 300 years of conclave history, no species had ever responded to the Vorkai revealed with anything other than terror. There were protocols for this moment, training manuals, entire chapters in the Diplomatic Intimidation Handbook devoted to managing the psychological collapse of frightened delegation. There was nothing about a delegation that wanted to know what the monster ate for breakfast. Kale fumbled, glancing at his aide, a thin offering attaché named Drevis who looked equally lost. The Vorkai is an apex predator, Ambassador Voss. It does not have prey in the conventional sense. It simply consumes whatever crosses its path. That's not really an answer, Serafina said, leaning forward with genuine interest now. Behind her, the rest of the human delegation had begun murmuring among themselves, and not in the hushed, terrified tones Kale expected. They sounded excited. A younger man near the end of the table. His briefing notes identified him as Dr. Marcus Chun, listed as an agricultural and biological advisor, whatever that meant in this context, leaned toward Serafina and said audibly, "Look at the jaw structure. That's not built for tearing soft tissue. That's built for crushing. Bone-crushing predator. Has to be. Big calorie requirements for a body that size." Right. Serafina nodded, eyes still fixed on the Vorkai, which had begun to shift its weight uncomfortably under the unfamiliar scrutiny. Predators were used to being feared. They were not used to being assessed. So we're looking at something with a metabolism that needs serious protein density, high muscle-to-fat ratio if it's evolved for a chase-and-kill lifestyle on a hostile world. Unless it's an ambush predator, Marcus countered. Look at that armor plating. That's defensive, not offensive. Could be it doesn't chase much at all. Sits and waits. Kale's translator Crystal sputtered, struggling to keep pace with a conversation that had nothing to do with anything he understood as diplomacy. "Excuse me," he interrupted, raising his voice slightly, the way conclave training taught delegates to do when reasserting control of a negotiation. "Ambassador Voss, I don't believe you fully grasp the situation. This creature is lethal. It has killed conclave handlers during transport. It is, by every metric we possess, the most dangerous organism your delegation has ever encountered." "Oh, I understand that completely," Serafina said, finally turning her full attention back to him, and something about her calm, pleasant tone made Kale feel far more uneasy than any amount of shouting would have. "I just think you're underselling it." "Underselling it? Ambassador, do you have any idea what a creature like this would be worth?" Kale opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Worth 12 meters of muscle mass," Serafina said, gesturing toward the Vorkai with the casual authority of someone discussing livestock in auction. "Armor-grade hide that could be processed into industrial materials. A biology clearly built for extreme environments, which means incredible resilience, disease resistance, temperature tolerance, the works. And depending on its growth rate and reproductive cycle, you might be looking at one of the most efficient large-scale protein sources in the known galaxy. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence belonged entirely to the conclave side of the table. Protein source. Kale repeated slowly, as though saying the words aloud might reveal some hidden, more sensible meaning. You are suggesting that the Vorkai, the apex predator of an entire planet, could be eaten. I'm suggesting it could be farmed, Serafina corrected, with the patient tone of someone explaining a concept to a particularly slow student. There's a meaningful difference. If it's a viable agricultural species, sustainable breeding cycles, manageable containment requirements, decent feed-to-mass conversion ratio, we could be looking at a genuine solution to several long-term food security concerns back home. Behind her, Dr. Chun had already pulled out a small tablet device and was sketching something that looked disturbingly like a ranch enclosure design, muttering about fence height requirements, and whether electrified containment would even register against that hide. The Vorkai, sensing the shift in attention without understanding it, let out another deep, rumbling growl. The same sound that had once sent the entire Offrin negotiating team fleeing the chamber in terror. This time, 3 human delegates leaned forward to listen more closely, and one of them murmured something about vocalization patterns possibly indicating territorial behavior rather than aggression. Kale's hands had begun to tremble slightly. He looked toward his handlers, the 2 suited conclave operatives still gripping the Vorkai's restraint harness, silently begging them with his eyes to do something. Anything, to restore the natural order of fear and submission that this meeting was supposed to follow. The handlers, for their part, looked just as bewildered as he felt. "Ambassador Kale," Serafina said gently, almost sympathetically, "I think there might have been a slight miscommunication about what this demonstration was meant to accomplish." "It was meant," Kale said, his voice cracking slightly, "to demonstrate the overwhelming power and danger of the Conclave's resources in order to encourage your delegation to reconsider its position on proposed trade terms." "Right," Serafina said, "and it has absolutely done that. It's just—" She paused, glancing back at the Vorkai, which had now gone very still, watching the humans with an expression that, for the first time in his life, resembled confusion rather than predatory focus. "It's convinced us your civilization has access to an incredible, underutilized resource, which, frankly, makes us a lot more interested in opening trade discussions, not less." Somewhere in the back of the chamber, Drevis the Offrin attaché had begun quietly typing an emergency message back to Conclave Central Command, and his hands were shaking too hard to get the words right on the first 3 attempts. By the time the second hour of negotiations began, Ambassador Kale had stopped trying to control the room and started silently praying for an evacuation order that never came. What had once been a tightly scripted intimidation demonstration had collapsed into something resembling a chaotic agricultural seminar. The human delegation had pulled their chairs closer together around a holographic display that Dr. Chun had projected mid-table, showing rough biological diagrams of large terrestrial predators alongside notes scrawled in rapid, excited shorthand: muscle density, fat marbling potential, gestation cycle unknown, hide tensile strength. Industrial applications? "Look," said a woman near the end of the table. Her name tag, translated awkwardly through Kale's crystal, read logistics specialist R. Abra. "Even if the meat-to-bone ratio isn't ideal, we're talking about a species that's clearly thriving in an extremely hostile environment. That kind of resilience is exactly what we need if we're serious about off-world food production. Forget Earth. This thing could feed colony outposts that can't sustain conventional livestock. The containment requirements alone would need serious engineering," Marcus Chin replied, still sketching. "But that hide plating practically solves half our predator defense problem for free-range setups. We wouldn't need anywhere near the fencing budget we'd need for, say, cattle on a hostile world." "What about taste?" Abra asked, turning toward Serafina with genuine curiosity. "Has anyone actually—" "No," Serafina said, then paused, glancing thoughtfully at the Vorkai. "Not yet, anyway." Kale felt something inside him crack. "Not yet," he repeated, his voice rising an octave higher than he intended. Ambassador Voss, this is the single most feared organism in the Outer Reach systems. The Offering surrendered an entire mining colony rather than negotiate while this creature was in the room. The Threll Collective ceded 3 trade routes within minutes of seeing a recording of it, and you are discussing it like he struggled to find a human word, finally settling on the one his translator offered, like a farm animal. Well, Serafina said, not unkindly, to be fair, you did bring a giant, biologically fascinating creature into a trade negotiation. What did you expect us to talk about? Fear. Kale snapped, then immediately seemed embarrassed by his own outburst, smoothing the front of his formal robes. I expected fear, Ambassador. Submission. The recognition that you are powerless against a force this dangerous. Serafina considered this for a moment, glancing again at the Vorkai, who had by now settled onto its haunches, looking almost bored by the lack of screaming. Its massive head tilted, 6 eyes blinking in a slow, staggered rhythm as it watched the humans with what could only be described as cautious, wary confusion, an apex predator experiencing, for perhaps the first time in its existence, the unfamiliar sensation of not being the most intimidating thing in the room. Ambassador Kale, Serafina said finally, I think you're laboring under a fairly significant misunderstanding about what humans find frightening. Enlighten me, Kale said, somewhat acidly. We're not afraid of large animals, she said simply. We've lived alongside large, dangerous animals our entire existence as a species. We've hunted things bigger than this. We've domesticated things almost as dangerous. To us, a 12-meter predator with thick hide and a heavy carnivorous diet doesn't look like an unstoppable horror. She gestured at the Vorkai. It looks like an opportunity. An opportunity, Kale echoed flatly. A resource, Serafina clarified. Something we want to study, classify, and figure out how to use. Humans have spent 10,000 years turning dangerous wild animals into livestock, medicine, labor, and yes, food. It's sort of our specialty. If you wanted to scare us, Ambassador, you probably should have brought something smaller. Smaller? Kale's voice cracked entirely now. Something we couldn't immediately identify a use for, Serafina said. A nanoscale weapon. An unstoppable virus. Something abstract enough that we couldn't start mentally cataloging its commercial value within the first 10 minutes of looking at it. She shrugged. Honestly, you might want to take notes for next time. Behind Kale, his conclave aides had gone completely silent, several of them now exchanging a particular species of glance reserved for diplomats who suspect they have just witnessed their careers ending in real time. Drevis had stopped typing his emergency message entirely and was simply staring at his tablet, as though hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. The Vorkai itself let out a low, uncertain whine, a sound its handlers had never heard it make before in any prior demonstration on any world. It was, Kale realized with mounting horror, the sound of a predator that had just realized it was being evaluated rather than feared. This negotiation, Kale said slowly, trying to salvage some shred of the authority he'd walked in with, was meant to demonstrate Conclave's strength. And it has, Serafina said warmly, picking her coffee back up. It's demonstrated that the Conclave has access to a genuinely remarkable biological resource that you apparently don't know how to properly utilize. Honestly, Ambassador, we should be thanking you. This might be the most productive trade meeting we've had all year. Kale closed his eyes, took a long, slow breath, and tried very hard not to think about how this conversation would be reported back to Central Command. What Ambassador Kale didn't yet know was that somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, his emergency report had already arrived, and was about to make things infinitely worse. While Kale fought to regain control of a negotiation that had spiraled completely beyond his understanding, Drevis's hastily sent message had reached Conclave Central Command, where a junior communications officer named Pell received it during what should have been an uneventful shift. The message, garbled by Drevis's trembling hands and translated through 3 layers of bureaucratic protocol, read simply, "Humans not afraid of Vorkai. They want to eat it. Requesting immediate guidance." Pell read the message 4 times before forwarding it directly to Senior Diplomatic Coordinator Renasoff, who read it twice before declaring a translation error and demanding Drevis resend with corrected syntax. By the time the second message arrived, equally alarming, equally unambiguous, Soth had already convened an emergency advisory call with two other senior coordinators, all three of whom spent the first several minutes simply repeating the phrase, "They want to eat it," in tones of escalating disbelief. Back in the negotiation chamber, Ambassador Kale had no idea any of this was happening. He only knew that his carefully constructed demonstration of conclave power had become, somehow, a conversation about animal husbandry. "Let's refocus," Kale said, attempting to inject some authority back into his voice. "Ambassador Voss, regardless of your delegation's unconventional interest in the Vorkai, the fact remains that the Conclave possesses overwhelming military and biological superiority. I would strongly encourage your government to reconsider the trade terms we proposed last cycle, given this demonstration of livestock potential?" Serafina offered helpfully. "Of power," Kale snapped, then immediately regretted raising his voice, smoothing his robes again in a gesture that was becoming increasingly frequent and increasingly desperate. "This creature single-handedly secured your species' compliance, your unconditional compliance, in negotiations with 17 other civilizations." "Did it secure compliance?" Serafina asked, genuinely curious now. "Or did it secure surrender out of fear, before anyone bothered to ask basic biological questions? Because those are pretty different outcomes, Ambassador, and only one of them suggests good long-term diplomatic strategy on your part." Kale opened his mouth to respond and found, to his deepening horror, that he had no answer. It was at this exact moment that the Vorkai, perhaps sensing the shifting energy in the room, or perhaps simply growing impatient after 2 hours of restrained captivity, let out a thunderous roar that shook the table and rattled the overhead lighting fixtures. Every conclave delegate in the room flinched. Drevis actually yelped. The human delegation, to a person, leaned forward. "Oh, that's a great vocalization," Dr. Chen said, already adjusting a small recording device he'd apparently had running the entire meeting. "Did you catch the frequency range on that? There's a subharmonic component. That's going to carry for kilometers in open terrain. That's a territorial call, not an attack call. Completely different vocal structure. You can tell the difference?" Abra asked, leaning over his shoulder to look at the readout. "Pretty confident, yeah. Attack vocalizations tend to be shorter, higher frequency, more like a bark. This was long, low, sustained. That's a 'this is my territory, stay back' signal, not a 'prepare to die' signal." Kale stared at the two of them, his translator crystal practically vibrating with the effort of keeping pace with conversation that had abandoned every principle of diplomatic terror he understood. "The creature just demonstrated lethal vocal force," Kale said, weakly, more to himself than anyone listening. It is not a subject for casual bioacoustic analysis." "Sure it is," Serafina said cheerfully. "Everything's a subject for analysis if you're curious enough about it. That's sort of the whole point of science, Ambassador." The Vorkai, meanwhile, had begun shifting uncomfortably under its restraint harness, its 6 eyes darting between the increasingly animated human delegation and its own handlers, as if silently asking them what, exactly, was supposed to be happening right now. In 300 missions across 17 worlds, it had never once failed to produce abject terror within the first 30 seconds of a room. It had certainly never been recorded for vocal frequency analysis before. Kale's communicator buzzed sharply against his wrist. An emergency priority signal, the kind reserved for genuine crises. He glanced down, saw a coordinator Soth's identification code, and felt his stomach drop to the floor of the negotiation chamber. "If you'll excuse me," he said, his voice barely steady. "I need a moment." He stepped to the corner of the room, turned his back to the table, and answered the call with hands that had begun, for the first time in his 30-year diplomatic career, to genuinely shake. "Report," Soth's voice demanded through communicator, sharp and clipped with barely restrained panic. "Confirm or deny. Are the humans attempting to negotiate the purchase of the Vorkai?" Kale glanced over his shoulder. Dr. Chun had pulled out a second tablet and was now sketching what appeared to be a rough nutritional breakdown chart, while logistics specialist Abra discussed feed conversion ratios with 2 other delegates, and Serafina Voss sat at the head of the table, calmly sipping the last of her coffee, watching the entire spectacle with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just won a game the other side didn't realize they were playing. Coordinator, Kale said slowly, I don't believe purchase is quite the right word for what's happening. Then what word is the right word, Ambassador? Kale closed his eyes. I believe the appropriate word is menu. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. What happened in the next 20 minutes would later be studied, debated, and quietly mythologized across a dozen conclave member worlds. And it began with Ambassador Kale walking back to the negotiation table like a man approaching his own execution. Coordinator Soth has authorized me to explore alternative terms, Kale said carefully, settling back into his chair. His voice had taken on the strained, overly formal quality of someone trying very hard to sound like nothing had gone wrong. Given the unique nature of today's discussion. Wonderful, Serafina said brightly, setting down her empty coffee mug. Then let's talk specifics. What followed was, by any reasonable diplomatic standard, the strangest hour in galactic conclave history. Serafina Voss, flanked by Dr. Chun and Specialist Abra, laid out a series of proposals with the calm precision of someone who had clearly been planning this exact pivot the moment the Vorkai walked through the door. Though Kale would never be entirely sure whether she'd anticipated this specific outcome or simply possessed a terrifying ability to improvise an entire trade strategy around whatever was put in front of her. First, Serafina said, we'd like a formal scientific research permit, full access to Dreth Prime, under controlled and supervised conditions, to study the Vorkai's biology, behavior, and ecosystem role. We're not interested in destabilizing the planet's existing wildlife population. Quite the opposite. A healthy, sustainable population is in everyone's interest if there's any long-term agricultural potential here. Second, Chin added, we want exclusive negotiating rights on any future livestock or resource agreements involving Vorkai biology before the Conclave offers similar terms to any other species. We're not asking for ownership of the species. We're asking for a first position at the table. Third, Abra said, and this is the big one, we like the original trade agreement renegotiated. The terms your delegation proposed last cycle assumed we were dealing from a position of weakness. Given what we now know about conclave demonstration tactics, and given that we've apparently identified value in something your own civilization considers a feared apex predator rather than a usable resource, we think it's fair to say the power dynamic in this relationship needs a second look. Kale stared at the three of them, then at Serafina, who was watching him with an expression that managed to be simultaneously friendly and utterly merciless. You're proposing, Kale said slowly, that in exchange for not making this entire negotiation a galactic embarrassment for the Conclave, you receive a research permit, first position trade rights on an entirely new resource category, and a complete renegotiation of our existing trade terms in your favor. I wouldn't frame it as a threat, Serafina said gently. I'd frame it as recognizing a mutually beneficial opportunity. Though I will say, Ambassador, if this story does get out, and stories like this tend to travel, I imagine it might be a difficult one for the Conclave to spin favorably. Our ultimate intimidation weapon got treated like a county fair livestock exhibit. Isn't exactly the reputation you want circulating among the other member worlds. Kale's jaw tightened. Behind him, he could practically feel Drevis holding his breath, waiting for the explosion that, 3 hours ago, would have been entirely justified. Instead, Kale exhaled slowly, glanced one more time at the Vorkai, now slumped in apparent boredom against its restrained harness, utterly defeated not by force, but by sheer indifference, and made the only decision that made any sense anymore. Draft the terms, he said quietly. I'll review them with Central Command. It took less than 2 hours for Central Command to approve nearly everything. Coordinator Soth, when informed of the full details, reportedly sat in silence for almost a full minute before stating, with the particular weariness of someone watching 3 centuries of diplomatic doctrine collapse in real time, just give them what they want. Quietly, before anyone else finds out how this went, the research permit was granted within the week. The renegotiated trade agreement, overwhelmingly favorable to Earth, in terms that the original Conclave delegation would never have offered voluntarily, was finalized within the month, and the first position resource rights, though their practical value remained uncertain for the time being, were logged into conclave trade records as an unprecedented concession to a species that had, by every conventional metric, just lost a demonstration of overwhelming force. Except, of course, they hadn't lost anything at all. As the negotiation chamber finally emptied, Serafina Voss paused at the door, glancing back one last time at the Vorkai, now being carefully, almost gently, led back into its containment pod by handlers who seemed considerably less confident in their jobs than they had been that morning. "Ambassador Kale," she said. He turned wary, half expecting one final demand. "For what it's worth," she said, "that really is a remarkable animal. I hope the research goes well. We're genuinely curious about it, not just as a resource. It deserves better than being used as a scare tactic." For the first time since the meeting began, Kale found himself with absolutely nothing intimidating, defensive, or strategic to say. He simply nodded and watched the human delegation file out of the chamber, already discussing logistics for their first research expedition, as though the entire encounter had been nothing more than an unusually productive afternoon. Within a single galactic news cycle, every civilization in the conclave would learn a lesson that no amount of military doctrine or diplomatic training had ever prepared them for, and it would change the way an entire galaxy looked at humanity forever. The story spread faster than anyone in the conclave could contain. Drevis's panicked early reports, despite Coordinator Soth's attempts to quietly bury the incident, had already been relayed through 3 separate communication channels before anyone thought to flag them as confidential. Within days, the account of what had happened aboard the conclave diplomatic vessel had become the single most discussed piece of interstellar gossip in recent memory. The offering government, still nursing the humiliation of their own earlier surrender to the Vorkai, found the story almost too delicious not to share. The Threll Collective, having seeded 3 trade routes under similar circumstances, reportedly held an entire closed-door session simply replaying the recovered audio of Serafina Voss asking, with total sincerity, "What does it eat?" What had once been the Conclave's most feared diplomatic tool became, almost overnight, a galaxy-wide punchline. Other species began referring to the incident simply as the Earth question. Shorthand for the moment, an intimidation tactic meant an opponent who was fundamentally incapable of being intimidated by biology alone. Ambassador Kale, for his part, was quietly reassigned to a minor trade post on a remote agricultural world, a transfer that Coordinator Soth insisted was unrelated to recent events, though everyone involved understood the timing rather clearly. He would spend the remainder of his career fielding occasional, pointed questions from colleagues about livestock management, a joke that followed him for the rest of his diplomatic life. The Vorkai research program, however, flourished. Dr. Marcus Chun led the first official expedition to Dreth Prime 6 months later, accompanied by a team of biologists, agricultural specialists, and, somewhat to Conclave's continued bewilderment, a culinary research division that had been quietly assembled within weeks of the original incident. Early findings suggested the Vorkai was, in fact, an ambush predator rather than pursuit hunter, exactly as Chun had guessed from its armor plating, and that its diet consisted primarily of large burrowing megafauna native to Dreth Prime's southern continent. Whether the species would ever become a viable agricultural resource remained, for the time being, an open scientific question, but the cultural impact of the inquiry itself had already done its work. Across a dozen member worlds, diplomatic strategists began quietly revising their approach to negotiations involving Earth. Memos circulated advising against any demonstration involving large, biologically impressive creatures, on the grounds that human delegates showed a statistically significant tendency toward agricultural and culinary curiosity rather than appropriate fear response. One particularly blunt internal report from the Threll Collective summarized a new doctrine in a single line that would later be leaked, translated, and passed around extensively among amused human diplomats. Do not show them anything you would not want them to eat. Humanity, for its part, embraced its new reputation with characteristic enthusiasm. Serafina Voss became something of a celebrated figure in diplomatic circles, not for any grand strategic genius, but for what other species had come to recognize as a peculiarly, almost dangerously human trait, an inability to be cowed by raw size or ferocity alone, paired with an immediate, irrepressible curiosity about whether the terrifying thing in front of them might be useful edible or both. It became something of a running joke across the galaxy that humans didn't fear monsters. They wondered what they tasted like. Years later, when a delegation from a newly contacted species inquired, somewhat nervously, about rumors they'd heard regarding Earth's first encounter with the Galactic Conclave, the official response from the Earth Diplomatic Corps was characteristically understated. "We had a productive meeting. We're still working out the recipe." And somewhere on Dreth Prime, under careful, well-funded scientific supervision, a small breeding population of orcai roamed a newly established wildlife preserve, feared by every species in the galaxy except the one that had looked it in its 6 eyes and asked, with genuine curiosity, what it might taste like with the right seasoning.